Right. I'm very pleased to be doing this with Iain because there's lots of questions that I wanted to ask him, and it's nice to be given a public forum to do them. Can I start off by asking you something that I think is probably a bit audacious, but in something like Whitechapel Scarlet Tracings, there are characters based on book dealers, one of which is you, to an extent.
To an extent.
And I wondered now, in The Last of London, to what extent are you writing Iain Sinclair as a sort of character? When you see something, do you think about how you respond to it, or do you think about how this sort of character that's been created of you, by you, responds to it?
Well, I think, you'd probably understand that more than anybody, is this idea that the performed self is a very different self to whatever the real messy core is, and that over a long period of time you kind of create a projection that's loosely associated with things that happened in my life and that have gone on through a long trajectory. And so the book-dealing scavenger of Whitechapel Scarlet Tracings is still present, but neither of them are, as I think, the me who would like really to be sitting quietly away in some corner, sort of scraping and scribbling. It's fascinating because the other characters who I've drawn on, especially in Whitechapel Scarlet Tracings, one was a book dealer called Martin Stone, one was a guy who went by the name of Driffield. They were hardly fictionalized at all. And so when I did that book, it appeared that I was pretending to write fiction, but I was really just riffing on things that were happening in my life. And now I'm pretending to write non-fiction, but Martin Stone, for example, has returned to this book as a ghost.
Right.
And so, you're at the mercy of these characters that you create and draw upon. Be careful who you listen to.
So when you're out and about doing your perambulations and you see the sorts of things in East London or in the east of England that have informed this book, do you ever find yourself thinking, well, I've thought this about them, but I wonder what the Iain Sinclair character would think about this and how he would express it? Because it does seem there's a sort of heightened version.
See, I think, again, you're being more subtle than I am.
Okay. Because
I've read your account of deconstructing your act, and this is seriously intellectual. I mean, this is St Edmund's Hall, Oxford. Listen, my thing is much more crude and instinctive in that, I accept that there is a kind of version of the city that I've contrived over a long period of time, but I don't really take it that seriously. Okay.
Well, do you put yourself in situations to see what will happen?
Yes.
When you perhaps should have left?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely. When you've taken on the responsibility for writing something, that overrides everything. And I would put myself into situations in normal life I wouldn't go near. If I can arrange to have some fall guy with me to do it, I'll do that. So someone like Andrew Cottingstay, who I've collaborated with a lot recently, is absolutely full on. He's like 1,000,000 miles an hour, permanent performance artist. Anybody we meet, he'll go straight into it. Then I can stand back and be in that role of the observer and writer. So I'm very happy to do that.
So when I don't know if anyone's seen the work that Iain's done with Andrew Cotting, but he seems to sort of almost use you in those films, which I appreciate our collaborations.
It's a mutual kind of cannibalism.
Yeah, he sort of thinks, what would happen if I put this person into this situation, and it's you, isn't it? Which means he gets different perspectives on the same event.
But in one of these films, Swandown, there's a fiberglass swan peddler taken from Hastings to Hackney. And there were two really important aspects of this for me. One is I realized for the first time you can cheat, because I had a terrible morality about writing. If I walked round the M25, I really did walk round every yard of it because I wanted to see what would happen. And all of the books were like that. If I walked round the overground, I'm doing it. With Andrew, actually the reality was the film. The film was the reality. And if you needed to cheat and come to the end of the River Rother and chuck the thing on a low loader and move it to the next place along Tunbridge, then you do that. And fine. And then when we get to Tunbridge and the Swan goes back into the river, who should arrive but Alan Moore and Stewart Lee? And this is, with Andrew, there's no preparation, you're just thrown onto this thing. And I thought you came up with a very good critique of me, which I laughed at, which was part of this conversation. You said, like, oh, he thinks nothing can happen in Hackney without his permission. And I thought, this is horribly untrue, but also it's very funny.
I'm sorry, this is clearly
kind of truth
festered for a decade.
And that managed to survive in the cut too.
Well, yeah, but that was when Hackney libraries weren't allowing you to speak in
true.
Hackney because
Look, I couldn't speak in Hackney libraries, but I'm now in a Hawksmoor church, so I don't know what Hawksmoor thinks about it, because that's a theme that's run through everything I've done.
So what you're saying is working with Andrew, who sort of looks like a documentary filmmaker, but is in fact making sort of fictions, enabled you to write what still feels like documentary and what is published in a serialised form, often in the London Review.
There are more fictional construction in the last few books I've done, because I really wanted to write novels, but the market wouldn't allow that. Essentially, I was stuck with my brand, which was this form of London wandering and scavenging. And so, for example, at the end of this book, there's a long Brexit walk in which this troupe of sort of random figures, musicians and poets and people, straggle down from Waltham Abbey to the coast. And I wanted at the end of it to do a final chapter in which, I'd planned this for some time, Andrew and I would walk in a single day from Hastings to Canterbury. And as circumstances evolved and as the deadline arrived, I couldn't do it. It wasn't possible. So I wrote it without doing it. And so the end of the book is actually a fake, except that the business in the ossuary, where there are St Leonard's Ossuary in Hythe, I really did go there and all these skulls, but the rest of it I kind of just made up from a series of previous. But then, just to finish, my morality insisted that I actually do it when the book was finished. So then, subsequently, immediately we set off on a walk with Andrew Cotting, which took us to Canterbury and then back to London.
So you felt obliged to form your own fiction
Yes, my
afterwards.
own fictions, then lay down an moral obligation that you have to live by them. I don't know what that is, but it's...
Where the apparent documentary writing appeared to drift into fiction, where the alarm bells rang for me was in Rose Red Empire, where you said you found a temple of a Roman god in the cellar of your house in Hackney. Was that true?
It is true.
I thought that was obviously made up.
What it was, I don't know. It was one of the strangest times of my life when I wrote this. I wrote a book, Downriver, and it was the whole world had collapsed around me. The house was actually being physically pulled down. It was a long-term project, and all that was going on. My father died. I had to go down to Wales and deal with that. My mother was drifting away into a kind of her own version of the past. My wife was in hospital. I was looking after the kids, and I had a couple of hours a day to write. In the middle of this, we had these kind of Irish builders out of faulty towers, and they would come for a couple of days, and you wouldn't see them for weeks. Anyway, one day they come and say, we've just found this thing underneath your kitchen. So they kind of take me down, and there is this thing that could have been a holy well or whatever it was, I don't know. And they said, listen, if we say anything about this, we've got to call the council and, you'll be stuck for months. So I said, okay, just chuck the concrete in, fill it in. And then I realized this may have been a horrendous mistake. But I did believe it was some sort of ritual found.
Well, but you've trapped the energy in there. That's very dangerous, what you've done. The concrete over the spirit.
I know, but when I researched it more seriously, I found that this whole area, though there'd never been any houses built on it before, had been brick kilns. It'd been all market gardens and brick kilns. And I think what this was actually a brick kiln for making the bricks that formed the City of London. So I don't feel too bad about it now. Though who knows, in sort of Lovecraftian terms, something horrendous may be waiting.
Who knows what will happen to the fictional Iain Sinclair in that case. This in The Last of London, you write a lot about how, well, funny enough, one of the quotes I pulled out of the book, reading it again this week, is actually the same one as on the back, about London being centrifugally challenged to the point of obliteration, and you feel like it's no longer a place you can relate to. It doesn't have much in common with the London of the late 60s, early 70s. But it's not just London that's changed in that period. It's you've changed as well, haven't you? And in the book, everything is put onto the city and the forces that have worked upon it, rather than
there is a reason for that. I mean, I'm not a Londoner. Like most other people, I came by accident in the '60s for a weekend in Hackney, and I never had the imagination to leave. But what happens is, after a long period of time, it's like The Third Policeman with Flann O'Brien, that you exchange your molecules with the city until literally that you can't separate the two in your own mind. And what I was thinking of was the writer Steve Moore, who wrote a lot of comics and was something of a mentor to Alan Moore. And there's a piece Alan Moore wrote about him called Unearthing in a book I edited called City of Disappearances. And what happens there is there's a tiny little walk around the top of Shooter's Hill. Suburban walk, takes in a pub, and it also takes in a Bronze Age burial mound where Steve's ashes were scattered. And in this piece that Alan writes, at the very end of it, you go round this circuit, you arrive at this burial mound, and Steve Moore gets to the point where he thinks he can't differentiate between himself and Shooter's Hill. And essentially, he's become Shooter's Hill. The houses are his eyes. He sees the grass shimmering on this mound. He sees the leaves shivering, and he knows that he is Shooter's Hill. And all he's got to do is become a kind of medium for that place. And I think that's the sense that what happens in London after obsessively tramping it for so long, there's no difference. All you're doing is articulating aspects of the city that you notice that are slightly changing all the time.
Well, what's really changed in this book, and I suppose some of the earlier ones, is you seem to have got fixated on certain details that weren't significant 10 years ago that seem to suddenly stand for a lot. Phone usage, bicycles, the way that the canals...
Especially when they're combined.
Yeah, phone usage and bicycles. I mean, the stuff about bicycles is really funny. When I first read those bits, they seemed, when you first started writing about bicycles a lot in the London Review of Books, it seemed an extreme position, and then suddenly we can see all the planning, everything that was behind it.
I mean, there's lots of good things about the idea of bicycles and cities, but just walking down here from King's Cross now tonight through those sort of relatively quiet Bloomsbury-ish back streets, the killers are the bicycles. They're coming out of nowhere, and you can't hear them, and they're around you. They've taken up a position in the city that has changed the nature of the city, from the point where in earlier times the bicycles were being used by workers going to work. They couldn't afford to have any other form of transport, so they're on bikes. Then it became actually it was a class thing, that the bike was a status symbol, and you had to be quite wealthy to have one of the bikes.
So it would actually make the process which you've used for years of just wandering about is much more difficult now because of the way those spaces are occupied by professional class cyclists.
I mean, particularly things like canal banks are absolutely lethal. They're the kind of the fault line of everything that's going on in the city is there. I mean, just to the extent there's this guy I see every day, I'm really quite shocked. Is under Mare Street Bridge, there's a man now who's chosen to sleep in a sleeping bag there because of the bicycles. The bicycles offer a kind of form of protection because there's so much traffic, nobody can get near to remove him. So he's there. And the kind of few walkers that are there leave tributes for him, and every day someone leaves an energy drink and a banana. And then a week or so ago, I was walking there, and I saw that the banana had cycle tracks right through the middle. Right. I thought this is a symbol of this kind of new London, where the thing that freaks me is that the various groups are atomized. They don't see each other. We're like a series of different ghosts in different time frames who do not interconnect with each other.
Yeah, and yet when you hear 50 years ago, you felt it was more integrated, and now that all these different tribes are...
Yeah. Well, it was all a mess. I mean, essentially, when I arrived in Hackney, we were a kind of a content provider for we were because we were kind of bohemian, so we were freakish. We were wide open to be burgled, so we were kind of burgled every other day while we had anything. The cars, when you had cars, were always smashed in. But nevertheless, it actually felt in some weird way a kind of better dialogue. And when the police came round to look at the house after one of these burglaries, I remember very vividly, they came in, and really they just used that as an excuse to nose around your house. And they went up to the room that I had all the books and stuff in and said, "Oh my God, this is terrible what they've done here." Nothing had happened. That was just my room.
I like the way you use the story of the mole man of Hackney to exactly examine that idea. You talk about how a genuinely eccentric figure mines out this hole to live in, full of junk, but then the same space is subsequently appropriated by artists in a knowing way, and that seems to say a lot about your attitude to what's happened to the city, or to life generally, actually, where things that happened naturally as a result of eccentric outgrowths of personality suddenly have to become sort of commodified in some way.
This kind of level of hyper self-consciousness, and the level that everybody knows everything and everybody can blog everything. So we live in this sort of pressurized present tense, rather than, I think the most important thing, the only thing I've learnt in all of this, is that time is this sort of series of parallel strands that run, and that if there's a linearity from the first book to the last book, there's also much weirder things going on at the same time, and they weave together. And so you need to get into a sense where anything and everything is happening at the same time. Thomas de Quincey is stalking his figure, walking Stewart today. He's out there. We're in this Nicholas Hawksmoor church. You know that Andrew Marvell got married here, or that this is a wrongly aligned Hawksmoor church and it's part of a weird pattern I was fiddling with years ago, and yet here we are back doing this thing. We're all wired up, and it's being filmed. And that's unthinkable, but it is the way that it's happening simultaneously and spontaneously in a plural world.
There seemed to be in this book a lot of rather more straightforward comedy that obviously I enjoyed, which is, this section where you're, well, maybe it's because the character of Iain Sinclair in this, as this sort of rather sort of fogyish observer sometimes, you're able to enjoy being baffled by the vocabulary of young people. And there's a number of places where that happens, where you write long stream of consciousness paragraphs about stuff you've overheard on the tube.
Because you can't avoid it.
Yeah.
This is the thing. Once upon a time, this was obviously it was going on, but now it's like theatre. I mean, every time you step on a train, you're into this incredible babble. People are shouting these half-heard conversations, and I obsessively started to take down some of this stuff.
Would that be a good bit to read?
Yeah.
Yeah.
You're going to read it?
Well, or you can.
Oh, you do it.
All right, okay, I'll do it. Well, can I do the so bit from page 32?
Yeah, you do that, and I'll do another bit.
And maybe 94, 95, I quite like that as well. All right.
Great.
Information junkies were walking faster, heads down, from flats and boats, from ramps and roads, zeroing on the digitally illiterate, making them swerve and cringe. So essentially I forgot to, this is people on phones, so essentially I forgot to take the keys back. So ideally that works for you basically, the 22nd of September, 3 days or 4 days is just fine with me. So the problem is I don't know any proper men, all I know is women. So it might be an idea if you speak to the concierge. So take them, I've got a fridge full of fruit. So he's a chocolate maker, that's very exciting. So dancing with a dog, yeah, honestly, a dog. So he said I should get Botox. So I'm applying for a US teaching visa, and I'm also applying for German, just in case. So they're all raised in incubators all over the country, but once they mate for life. Boris is behind all that. People are so hungry, they're starving, so it's like sex on your wedding night. So I rang Stacey to say, what's the air temperature in Melbourne? Very important. I'm allergic to honey, so I can't eat cornflakes. So do you know Will Smith? Uber to Shoreditch House costs about £8. That's every journey you have out.
Yeah, that's every journey. That's the canal. This is, I'll just read a little bit about, one of the things I was very concerned about with London is as the surface was being more and more colonized and overtaken by development, it seemed to be the idea that the only thing left to invade was underneath. So there's a whole notion of digging down, and Crossrail is obsessively digging one after another the project. And to counter this spirit, and I noticed this building is now gone. There's a rectory by St. Augustine's Tower, which was the oldest building in Hackney. a vestigial remnant of something very ancient. There were a group of people living in the rectory who felt that they were living in the last of times, in a sense. And what they do is they burrow down through the lawn of the rectory. They make a kind of tunnel which becomes a camera obscura. And all kinds of disparate voices in Hackney are invited to go down into this hole and do their own thing. I thought this was very intriguing. And I went along to see what they were doing. And this is a bit... And the thing about this was that once they'd finished, after a certain number of months, then the hole was filled in exactly as it had been, and it was left as it was. And now the rectory and everything else I noticed last night walking through there was obliterated. There was earth inside them, and they dug, wrote Paul Celan. And with those words I felt the scratch of curved claws against the distended drum of the belly. Earth calls to earth, but the earth I pictured when I employed that disquieting quotation in a book of poems published in 1973 was ballast in the intestines of a deranged European archaeologist, sunstruck in the desert, uncovering a Sumerian ziggurat, deciphering cuneiform tablets. Or that earth was hard-baked and red in Yucatan with the giant poet Charles Olson, sweating and striding and fingering Mayan shards to provoke a spark of inspiration to carry him forward. The earth was inside them, certainly, but it was not here. It was never London. We had allotments beside railways and canals, poisoned land in recovery, modest gardens waiting on the next grand project, which was oblivion. They tear up the earth, I said, searching for their fathers. And again they dig, and the earth is sweet. The Hackney hole is 8 square metres straight down through the tidy lawn of a former rectory, close to the heart of the village settlement on the banks of the buried Hackney Brook. This private garden is separated from St. Augustine's Tower by a wall of weathered brick. The periscope thrust of the square tower is all that remains of the borough's oldest ecclesiastical building, a 16th century revision of a 13th century church founded by the Knights of St. John. The whole is a statement, and it's properly capitalized. The labourers, a self-confessed art collective, work the whole by hand with pick and shovel, turn and turn about, and it takes them 4 days to complete the shaft. And this is achieved without any of the tortured grinding and screeching and gouging that attends civil engineering projects that carve so recklessly through tarmac and concrete, the heavy clay of this loudly regenerated fiefdom, down and down again through the pipes and wires of utility companies that treat their cone-protected pits as art installations organized to impede traffic, to block junctions and towpaths. A many-tongued militia and yellow tabards retreat to their all-day breakfasts and tabloid-insulated porter cabins, and it's easy to believe that Mare Street and Morning Lane have been rebranded as Volca highways, considerate constructors. The noise, the din those improvers make, the decibels of patronizing signs, the notices that appear in advance of demolition. The defining political requirement of our era is the art of getting your apology in first and often, and letting the world know that you're sorry about being sorry. You're wet-eyed and you're stiff-lipped on the cusp of another upwardly mobile resignation. Utilities are billboards. There's not a dust cart without a grandiose statement of intent. This is an ecology of excess. This is a slow death of meaningful language. This is lies as lies. And these are what I find on the walls of Hackney. Transforming waste, investing to improve our streets, working for a better tomorrow, investing in a walking environment, creating space to inspire. Just enough is more. Our property knowledge gives you power, turning ideas into business, world leader in paintball. Thieves beware, working in partnership with Hackney Council. Own a piece of East London heritage. CCTV cameras have been installed for the purpose of crime. Investing in competitiveness. Impossibility is nothing. Hackney is more interesting than history.
Hackney is more interesting than history.
Perfect, right?
Yeah, well, do you think I moved to Hackney in, Stoke Newington, which is posh Hackney now, but in the mid-90s. And I felt very lucky to be there then because I've been able to witness an area in transition. I've witnessed gentrification. I've witnessed types of people that I knew being priced out or moved out. I've witnessed all sorts of changes, and yet the history of the place is still there at ground level.
You've tapped into that history, the sort of Arthur Machen idea of he sees Stoke Newington as part of a sort of wonderful passage out of London into the Northwest Passage and the secret gardens and all that. Yeah, and that history has been important to you.
Well, it was good because it meant that I felt I could see the whole of society changing and write about it, but from one little corner of a place. And if there was ever a big idea happening, I could localise it into some experience that had happened in Stoke Newington or Hackney, because the diversity of people and the cut and thrust of all these sorts of ridiculous ideas that you boil down to these statements on walls were so in evidence that in a way I felt like I didn't almost need to go anywhere. I could always find a local story that I could slot myself into to write stand-up about, which reflected a bigger picture, even if it was something like different, communities deciding what religious garments they were required to leave on while they weighed themselves at the Weight Watchers, sort of things. Everything was there that you needed to find out about. And I wondered
how soon did you recognise that? It took me a while to realise that this was, in a weird way, kind of one of the centres of the universe. In terms, you didn't have to move; it was essentially all there.
Well, and also time would pass by you from what you could see the changes in society happening from your window, and I wondered, do you think that you would have ended up producing the same body of work had you lived even 3 miles in a different direction?
No, I don't think I would. Really, I don't think I would, because I grew up in South Wales, and I never really came to grips with that in any useful way until I was pretty old and went back to do a book called Black Apples of Gower. But here we are.
Oh, sorry. Yeah. I don't do this very often.
And then I lived, first of all, when I came to London, in Brixton and Streatham and South London, because I was in film school in the early 60s. And I didn't, I wrote bits and pieces, but there was no real focus to it. And then I lived in North London. And again, I got one thing out of it, which was around an event at the Dialectics of Liberation at the Roundhouse in Camden Town. And Camden Town was also changing quite interestingly. But then, quite by accident, I came to see some people in a communal house in Hackney. And once I'd moved there, it was almost like the scales falling, just walking out, feeling completely that all the elements I wanted and could possibly start to write about were there. And immediately I started one, being involved in a diary film project. We were filming all this life, and secondly, keeping notes just about the everyday life of working as a gardener and so on, until the perfect moment of combining working as a gardener and the strange stories of how badly we were treated and what was going on in the landscape with the process of the Hawksmoor churches, which I was cutting the grass for. And everything kind of fell together, and the whole business started there.
And are you sorry to sort of say farewell to this area of research now? This is the last of London, and you're about to start on a different
been a bit like you with the stand-up. I've said farewell, and then I've immediately started writing another one about the same stuff.
Oh, have you? What is your next project? Because when you said ask me about your next project, I assumed it was going to be something very different.
No, there's a grand next project.
Doing contemporary dance or something.
There's a theoretical.
Right.
But there's a real next project, which was the Wellcome Trust are having an exhibition in October, about a year's time, about buildings and health, and they contacted me and asked for a book that would appear in parallel but not be the book of the exhibition. And I just started to think, their pitch basically is that you live in certain kinds of housing, it causes certain kind of health conditions. And my take, feel weirdly opposite, was that people with certain kinds of conditions find the right buildings to bring them to. Essentially, we are carrying these around with us and we deposit them. So I've started to work on that, and obviously as soon as I started to work, a Hawksmoor Church appeared. I'm very taken with with the way that certain people have looked at Christchurch Spitalfields, the great drawings and paintings by Leon Kossoff. But in Christchurch Spitalfields there are a triptych by Rebecca Hind, which nobody notices, nobody acknowledges in the church. And they came for an exhibition in 2010, and they've just hung on to them ever since. And yet they're not there. They're like a veil of strange colour and I began to become very interested in that conjunction. And so once again, without meaning to, I found myself writing about exactly the same stuff, but from a different point of view.
So that is the next.
That's the book I'm working on. But beyond that, with the one I'm really kind of thinking out for a long time, is in Peru, because I know people ask what you're going to do next. I wanted something that was sufficiently far enough away to sound quite dramatic, and yet it's been there all the time. In a book called Dining on Stones, which was an attempt to do something somewhere else, which was in Hastings and the A13. One of the things that was there in fiction was a book written by my great-grandfather, who at this stage of his life he'd lost all his money, which was invested in coffee, which he'd been involved as a planter in Ceylon. It had all gone belly up, so he had no money, and he took a job from the Peruvian Corporation of London, who paid him £100 a month to make this incredible, probably leading to death, trip into the backwaters of these indigenous people that had never been explored in Peru. And he wrote an account of this and produced maps and stuff. And I've had that book around since I was a kid without really looking at it, hearing adults talk about it. And then I actually read it, and I realized everything I've done is stolen from this book. The tone of voice, the humor, everything is in there, along with photographs.
And had you read that book as a child?
I'd looked at the pictures, and I read it properly now as an adult. And I realized I had to kind of reprise that journey. And in part, the interesting thing was that when he met this particular tribal group, he persuades them to make balsa rafts and go on a journey that be out of their own knowledge, and they do, until they run up against these rapids and nearly kill themselves. And that's the point where Werner Herzog made Fitzcarraldo. Right. So I thought, oh, okay. we're off on this one. And luckily also my daughter became very interested in this, because she talked to her grandfather, my father, in ways that he'd never talked to me. When she was ill, she went down to stay there, and they had long kind of stories and anecdotes about this trip and this guy, so she knew more about it than I did, really. And she got in touch with an anthropologist, a woman who's working now with these people. And there are not many people who speak the language, and so she's determined to go back. And so it's kind of a nice project, cooking. I don't know where we'll go with it, but in the end I feel obligation that I've got to go there.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense, that it was basically taking an approach that your grandfather had worked on and applying it to your own environment, and then taking what you've learned from that back to the place that he worked out that approach.
I think the thing is, as you get really old, is that you got a good few years of shtick before you come to that. It's this moment when the barriers between yourself and the world sort of dissolve to some extent. You flow out more. So this book felt quite relaxed in a sense. I felt I'm coming to the end of this thing. I can just do that. And then after that, there's a real release, and there's a real sense of kind of it's all going, it's all going, but though I can't divide myself from what's out there. We're flowing, and if I can somehow get into this stream that he was in, somehow, we're going to come together, and I can see where all this urge, this neurosis came from.
In how many years' time do you think you'll feel that Peru isn't what it was?
Well, see, I never knew what it was before, which is a help. And so I've got a lot to learn about what it was before I know what it should be now.
Should we take some questions and see what they inspire? Has anyone got a question? Oh, that's awkward, isn't it?
You'll have to do another one.
Okay. Well, no.
Have you run out?
No, I haven't run out. I can. Well, I'll tell you what I was hoping that you would do, but you haven't. You're not going to do it. When you wrote somewhere about having been commissioned in the early 70s to write a first draft in the late 60s of a Conan film. Which,
yeah, we had a bit of an email exchange.
I know, and I thought, I assumed this was a made-up thing.
It's true. I mean, before I did any of this sort of business of writing about London, I came to London to try and get involved with films. I'm mainly documentary films. But what happened was that people I'd worked with in Dublin on various films, one of whom was a guy called Tom Baker, who was a great friend of Mike Reeves, who made Witchfinder General. And Tom wrote 2 films, The Sorcerers and Witchfinder General, with Mike Reeves. So I began to hang out down there in Yeoman's Row where he lived. He was quite a strange and interesting character. And moved into a world where there were these bizarre film projects floating about. The first one came off Bob Hope's daughter, Linda, who had been sent to make a documentary in India about mothers and children. And they were rather shocked when they got to India. It was a bit rough, and they never really stepped out of the air-conditioned limo. And they arrived back in London with no footage, and they had to deliver to Bob, who was quite heavy-duty, this film about Indian children. And so they kind of looked around for some young, impoverished filmmakers who would do it for next to nothing. And we then shot some stuff around Whitechapel with kids and in Kew Gardens, sort of jungly stuff, and interviewed Linda and her companion for many hours of tape, and we kind of fudged this together into a documentary that went out in California when they got back home.
You made a false documentary about India in Kew Gardens.
And the follow-up to this was the guy who did this with me, who's a painter, was met in a lift, a guy who had got some money from Hare, who was asked to do the original treatment of Conan, and he couldn't write. So his notion of doing this was he picked up various young would-be screenwriters around the place and got them all to write treatments, give them £100, and then he was going to combine them all into a finished thing. So with this other guy, we were given the job of doing this first treatment of Conan, and so I got all, the nice thing was all these Robert Howard paperbacks, a huge batch of them arrived in a great parcel. And I spent the next weeks just reading the whole lot in one hit and producing this script. And we both went away separately to do our first version, and we came back at the end of a week. And I'd kind of done it too quick, I'd written the whole treatment. And he had drawn some nice pictures that were going to go on the credits. So we kind of said, I'm not sure this is going to work. So I went away and I laboured on that, and I did produce this thing. And when, all those years later, the actual film
the Schwarzenegger one,
there were 2 sequences at least that I'm sure were derived from this strange original treatment.
See, I absolutely love that piece of trivia, that there are elements of your work in the Conan the Barbarian film. And I think that's a project you should revisit, because I would like to see...
Well, there is now, weirdly, and this is almost beyond belief, there's a Welsh academic from Aberystwyth who went out to Texas, Harry Ransom in Texas, where all my papers and detritus had been sent some while back. And he zoned in like you did on that. Yeah. And he read this thing. And he's now writing a thesis whereby he reckons that he can interweave this Conan treatment with aspects of Welsh mythology that he's been working on. As if I'd kind of intended this. Except only by accident, in as much as it was written largely in North Wales.
Well, I'd like you to go back to it and have Conan as an old man complaining about the gentrification of the strange fantasy world that he lives in.
It'd be a good routine.
But I mean, again, it's not a million miles away from you, is it? Because Howard was sort of corresponded with Lovecraft and these sorts of people. I think he's an interesting writer. He's a pulp writer, but there are occasionally brilliant bits in it where he kind of quite subversively managed to get quite literary things into the pulps. And
well, I was reading Lovecraft just sort of before that, really, by way of Brian Catling, who's a friend of mine who was an obsessive Lovecraft reader, and he was always passing on these things. So I was getting that sense of it. And what I didn't realise till I went there to Gloucester, Massachusetts, to do something on the poet Charles Olson, was that there were actually kind of strange connections, that a lot of Lovecraft was based on Gloucester and a visit he'd made to Gloucester, which has a very dark kind of occult, and Dogtown is a very, very peculiar...
Gloucester here?
Gloucester, Massachusetts.
Well, I was going to say,
not
for
here.
God's sake.
No, not here, unfortunately.
Lovecraftian tale.
Yeah, that would have been a lost tale.
Are there any other projects like that were hanging around that would seem a surprise to people that you'd worked on during that period? Because I mean, we were talking about it before we came on about. I was saying when I first came to London, it was much easier to make a start trying to do things in the arts in the late 80s, early 90s, because there were all sorts of weird little jobs you can get. I mean, I've written parts of an encyclopedia of gardening for the Royal Cultural Society, where I was told off for writing rather too florid things by my editor, who was Aldous Huxley's nephew, and would take us to the pub on Fridays. You remember in the 80s when everyone stopped working at lunchtime on a Friday, and show us photos of having his nappy changed by G.H. Lawrence and things like that. And that was and I only got it through, I didn't get it through any special connections. I just went to some,
that was more the nature of the city, these sort of weird conjunctions and things. I mean, 1967, when I did this film for German television about Allen Ginsberg and the dialectics of liberation, I mean, I literally wrote this much on a page about it. So a Dutch friend of mine went to Cologne, where WDR German TV was really good at that time, and they said, okay, here's the money, go and make this film. So you could, at that time in London, within 24 hours, I was ringing on the doorbell of where Ginsberg was staying with an American millionairess on Regent's Park, and they said, yeah, okay, we'll do that. And, you could do that. And I was corresponding with William Burroughs and publishing him when I was a student. I think I was the first person.
So even though we weren't all connected by email and the internet and Twitter, you're saying you got more quickly to these.
Because you could get to there weren't sort of barriers between you and the person. You could just turn up on their doorstep and ring the bell, and off you go. And then after that, I did a film script for The Shadows. It was a science fiction film set in Ireland where they had weird doubles. Because it was the moment they'd seen the Beatles films, how successful they were, and they wanted to do something kind of wacky.
There's a science fiction film about the Shadows.
Well, it doesn't exist because it never got made. But
there's a script somewhere.
There's a script. There's a script. You could probably find it in Texas if you.
Perhaps they should meet Conan.
So I'm saying this is it. This is an era of these. You never knew, and on the other side of it, you could go out the same day and get jobs as a gardener or working in breweries or whatever, something interesting, and be paid a pittance, but it would be enough to independently publish small press books.
Well, were you paid for the Shadows science fiction film?
No,
nothing.
But
you didn't. It wasn't your idea to submit.
It wasn't my idea. It was the idea of the person who did the music for Witchfinder General, who kind of thought he'd move across into production.
Yeah.
And so he said, do it, and I did it, but there was no money. I did get paid for Conan, 100 quid. So, yeah, there's quite a lot of money then.
Yeah. The Shadows and the Conan film, were they?
No, The Shadows was a rip-off.
Right. Was it?
Because they looked at it, what's that?
Right. When I was trying to research something about the acid folk movement as well, I was the only contemporary film of the Irish folk rock band Dr. Strangely Strange appeared to be shot by you.
It was.
About.
Yeah, it was.
Yeah. How did that come about?
Well, I was a big friend of theirs. We were in
Trinity College Dublin together.
Ivan Paul was a big friend of mine, and I directed him in a Beckett play.
Right.
And Tim Goulding was a friend another friend of mine, and Tim Booth, the third one, actually drew the illustrations for the William Burroughs piece I published in Dublin. So I knew them all in Dublin. Then when we were living in Hackney in a sort of series of communal houses, and they were coming over to record the first LP, they stayed with us. And this is when I was doing this 8mm film diary, so they just happened to be there, so they got swept into that. And now this was some of that material was cobbled together for a little DVD.
When in this book, you talk about those early days in Hackney and holding down 3 different jobs simultaneously and coming in damp at night, but you're able to look back at it in quite a romantic way now.
Yeah, well, the romantic thing about that particular thing was one of the 3 jobs was working at night on Liverpool Street Station for the Post, and it was a time of the IRA bombing campaign, so we were always a bit nervous carrying. But it was brought back to me by reading Sebald's Austerlitz, where he has a lot of stuff on Liverpool Street Station of these strange corridors and empty waiting rooms, and that ghostly sense of what the station was, the sort of carbonized arches and pillars. And it was really kind of a weird privilege to have those spaces available to you in that way, and then to cycle. I was on a bicycle. Cycle back home to Hackney in the middle of the night for a couple of hours kip.
Yeah, that's what
I had a bookstall, which was again an education, and working as a gardener, private gardener for £1 an hour in Hampstead.
And that was the era where knowing about the values of books, you could basically zip around London from place to place, up and down Charing Cross Road, and essentially trade one book to another shop 4 doors down if you knew that they'd underpriced it.
Yeah, well, the most extreme was Foyles. Used to put out books every morning in trays outside the shop. And the old book dealers I knew who were making scavenging a living would go through the Foyles trays outside the shop, make a selection, and then take them to the top of Foyles, where there's an antiquarian department, and sell them back. And there were a lot of things. I came in on the very end of this, but it was wonderful to see the economy of the city. It was like a kind of model of Thatcherism.
Yeah.
In that I scavenged a book on Club Row, Brick Lane, on a Sunday morning, and I would sort of look it up, see what it was, clean it up, give it out on the market in Islington on a Thursday, and by the following Monday it was in Savile Row, in a glass case, and you could see the 3-4 moves.
You could track the same book around the city.
Because it was a smallish group of people. It was a sort of, and the only thing was you couldn't sort of break that chain.
Yeah.
And when it began to fall apart was like on the edge of the internet, when people everybody, if you found a book in Brick Lane for nothing and you weren't prepared to sell it at the modest price, you knew that somebody somewhere was selling it for, you wanted to do that. Right. And then the whole thing fell apart. And so at the moment, obviously everybody knows the price of everything.
Yeah.
So that whole thing has fallen apart.
Yeah. And in some ways, the big game hunter aspect of being that sort of figure has gone now, hasn't it? Because of the internet. Because
totally.
you will find the thing you're looking for. It was
wonderful, but it was incredibly hard work. The hours were ridiculous. You were getting up very early every morning. But I think it would be in Farringdon Road on a Saturday morning, which was amazing. It was an adventure in itself. Portobello Road under the flyover on a Friday morning, where I picked up John Lennon in his own right for 50p in the gutter, and it was signed by all the Beatles and all their girlfriends and Helen Shapiro and everything. Yeah. And it sold for £1,000, which was a phenomenal amount of money in those days. That kept me going for months. So those things were there.
On the current tour, my set is made out of the second-hand DVDs of other stand-up comedians, and which I can get I won't pay more than 50p for any of them, and it's all about the collapse of physical media. But every night I'm required to destroy about 30 or 40 of them by stamping on them. And so I have to go every couple of weeks to these CEX trading places and buy hundreds of copies of 50p DVDs by stand-up comedians, and it's normally all right all around the country, but in Liverpool I was trying to buy about 50 of, there was hundreds of Michael McIntyre ones, and I bought about 50 of them, and they wouldn't let me do it because they said, we know what you're trying to do. I said, what am I trying to do? And they said, you're trying to make these scarce so that you can so that you can own all of them that are in Liverpool and then resell them back to us at an inflated rate. I thought, how desperate must people be in Liverpool if they think there are people trying to fabricate a second-hand, to drive up the market value of second-hand Michael McIntyre. And I was saying, no, I just smash them every night in public, which is harder to explain. But that it's interesting watching that is sort of the end of physical media, and the fact that in the charity shops now, where you would have found amazing things, everything's gone online. And I wonder again, is that part of why you feel it's the last London and time to say goodbye to the adventure of being a person who's interested in culture is sort of disappearing from it in a way? Because
I think again that's true. Yeah. I think it's all part of the kind of internet effect, which you've probably been talking about with Jarrett Kobeck. This idea of however all that knowledge superficially is available, but the older, deeper, stranger knowledge is kind of vanishing because there's no territory in which it can happen.
It's funny you should mention Jarrett Kobeck. If he is a new young American writer who's in denial about what a great writer he is. I think he sort of seems to be embarrassed by the fact that he's suddenly taken seriously by an establishment he
Well, it kind of goes against if what you do, your sense of self-image is to do with the idea that you're independent and heroic and embattled and hidden, and then suddenly you're wildly popular. That's quite hard to cope with.
Yeah. But I read coincidentally his last but one novel, I Hate the Internet, and this more or less back to back, and it seems strange that I Hate the Internet uses the gentrification of San Francisco as a way of looking at the sort of corporate takeover of the world by big internet companies, and it dovetailed really neatly with this book. And then I was in Bristol recently talking to a guy from a psychedelic band, The Heads, and he said his next album's going to be about the gentrification of Bristol. Everyone's being priced out into the countryside, and there's guys with good jobs sleeping in tents on the side of the river. It seems like it's almost the only story to tell at the moment, but precisely because it affects writers and artists so much. The very people that are either consuming or making work, the space in which they do it, the audience they pitch it to, is uniquely affected by the speed of these changes, isn't it?
It is, no, absolutely. And what with Jarrett Kobeck, I think I corresponded with him years and years ago at the time of something like Whitechapel Scarlet Tracings, when he was obviously looking at London as being some sort of baroque, mysterious place, and was interested in a kind of a poetic way of writing about that. And then gradually our paths merge again years and years later with very much the same attitude to the world, but he is living in the sort of devil's jaws in San Francisco, where all of this is absolutely manifest.
Yeah.
And the forms of public transport have been taken over by these super buses carrying people out to Silicon Valley, and everything is there, much more extreme than the version we're talking about here.
I mean, it almost happens too fast to document. By the time you've got it down on paper, it's...
But he's very good on the kind of lynch mob attitudes that emerge from internet technologies, that somebody relatively innocent can be pilloried, and it just becomes a tidal wave of stuff that's, which is not something I've gone into at all, because I don't really live on the media. I'm only seeing the effects of it on the surface of the world as I move across it.
I found it useful reading things like Twitter and below-the-line comments and articles, which takes us back to exactly where we started, which is I've decided about 10 years ago, almost subconsciously, that I would make my stage persona into the very person that all the people online who hated me appeared to hate. And I sort of became more like it, because it seemed that there was some sort of need for this figure, and which is sort of, I suppose, why I started off...
So it's worked quite well.
Yeah. I suppose it's why I started off asking you about the extent to which the voice is a construct. I'm going to see through as another... Yeah, before we...
Yeah, thank you. You mentioned Driffield earlier, and took me by surprise that you said there was nothing fictional about him. And I must admit, in your last few books, I've always rather hoped that perhaps Driffield will appear, but he never seems to anymore. What happened to him?
Well, I mean, the thing with Driffield is there's nobody called Driffield. It was an invented name from the start. He kind of manipulated this incredible persona, and he became very successful and quite a public figure by doing virulently rude guidebooks to the second-hand bookshops of England and covering all of them. So he was out eccentrically dressed, but he disappeared as you probably know, for a number of years. And one of the things that had happened there was that he thought someone was chasing him to make him pay some of the many, many outstanding bills that were after him. But the guy chasing him was actually trying to find him to give him a check, because one of his customers had died who collected magic books and had left him 25 grand. Only it took this guy about 2 years to catch up with him. And once he'd got this money, he lived in India for quite a period of time, and he emerged back in London and ran into all kinds of storms and disappeared from public view. He's still around somewhere, but he's very purposely not visible anymore. And the book trade and the areas that he lived in and on have gone. So essentially, he can't exist in that way anymore. I mean, he was one of the figures from the end of a long period of time. He'd have fitted into the eccentrics that you could have tracked him back into the Victorian era, but he's gone. And the other one, Martin Stone, just died not too long ago, and sort of appears in this book as a ghost.
Okay, we'll wrap it up. Thanks for coming, Iain Sinclair.
Thank you.
And it's been a great pleasure.